Hi, everyone. Sorry about that. Can everyone hear me now? Everything good? Steve Toy, am I speaking loud enough? Can you hear me appropriately? Cool. All right. Great. So, what I want to do first, welcome to Effective Bench Coaching. Essentially, what we're going to be talking about is centered around the role during a game. Um, as from my experience, being a good bench coach involves a lot of like session planning, a lot of being a part of sessions, stuff like that. There's a lot of stuff that happens prior to the game, like post game, during training, and all that kind of stuff. But what I'm going to be focusing on here is just the stuff that's important, well, that I found important during the game. So what I'd like to do is I've opened up whiteboard here, so everyone should be able to write hi, if you like. So you can write hi on the whiteboard, or you can write where you're from, whatever you like. Um, just let us know you're here, which league you're from, and feel free to change your color and all that kind of stuff. This is your first one. This is my first webinar, so I'm pretty clueless about how this is all working. Um, Cool. Right, we have people getting involved. Great. Hi. Ooh, cool. All right. Nice. Good one. Okay. Sweet. Hi, this is great. This is now going to be my background. CQS. Smash. Sydney City Smash. Austin. Oh, wait. No, what does that say? Austin, Texas. All right, cool. Hi. Cool, great. All right, so now we've gotten everyone writing hi. Um, you can also change your status in the little thing in the bottom right. I don't know if you guys have spotted that. So if you do need me to speak louder, Steve will tell you how to say that. But yeah, feel free to like muck around on the whiteboard if I'm boring you. Don't sweat it. Okay, so like I said, this discussion is very much centered around pretty much what you do during games. Um, so there's a lot of pre-halftime, post-game stuff that you may incorporate into your role within your league, or your bench coach might incorporate into their role within your league, which I'm not really going to touch too much on today. When I started planning this session out, I definitely worked out that I needed more than an hour. So I'm going to get straight into it. So the majority of my experience comes from a time when there was two people on the bench. Now, obviously, you have four. When there was two people, you'd be lucky if you had a mirror coach. Having a mirror coach was great. It helped extend your voice and extend your vision, essentially. But a lot of the roles that those two people do now can be spread out into the four people. So I feel like you can more efficiently uh, like segregate those tasks into the different people you have on the bench. But so what I'm gonna do, and the way I thought about this was I thought I just break down the functions that I adopted as a bench coach, the things that I would do. Um, and just kind of like go through each of them. There's not really going to be any particular order or of importance or anything like that. I feel like at different parts and in different games, one role could be more important than another. Different points in a game, different roles can be more important. The other thing, wow, look at all these people. The other thing that I will probably refer to on a number of occasions is the story of the game. Um, so I'm going to go into that a little bit first because I feel like it really informed quite a bit of the way that I bench coached specifically more recently. So when I first started bench coaching, after my very first game, one of our home team coaches came up to me and he said, "You know what? You got to stop focusing on the referees and start focusing on your players." And that was probably the best piece of advice that I ever got. Um, although I found it really hard to not focus on the referees all these years later. But anyway, the next kind of most pivotal change that I had was, as a team collectively, we would be adaptive with our strategy, or reactive. So when X happens, then we do Y. You know, this is kind of how I believe a lot of teams run their bench and run their strategies now. You know, if this is the situation, this is what we're going to do. And so that if X happens, then do Y is good, except for the fact that there are always a lot of other variables. So there's like, yeah, Z might be happening as well, or A, B, C, D, E. All of those variables might be happening as well. So just because X is happening does not necessarily mean that Y is the right thing to do. So what what I refer to is like the story of the game. So if X is happening, do Y. One of the things that I know people do most of the time in that regard is, and this is a real pet peeve of mine, is if the jammer's standing in the box, have your jammer call it off. And so I know there are absolutely times when that is a really good idea, but there are a lot of instances whereby that is not the right thing to do, because of all of those other variables that are involved in the game. So rather than every moment being a moment in which only exactly what has happened right here is what you're using to base your decision on, you think about all of the constant flow of events that have preceded this moment, and all of which have had an impact on the current event. And that's essentially why I like to refer to it as like the story of the game, a story in which like all of the players, coaches, the official, the crowd, the announcers, the DJs are all actors within that story essentially. So to simplify the example I just gave before, with if the jam is standing in the box, call off the jam. An example of why you wouldn't do it maybe is because that's their star jammer. Like, why are you keeping their star jammer on the track for the next jam? Like that's something I see a lot of people do. They will ice a jammer, and that jammer happens to be Scald Eagle or something like that. And you're like, well, that's a fucking mistake, because you want to keep her off the track as much as possible. So yeah, so that's kind of like what I'm thinking about. If I think about like a more complicated example, let's say it's not the star jammer, but you know that this person is an emotional rock, and being in the box is not going to mess with them. And they're actually playing really well against the pack that you're about to put out the next jam. So all of those things, there's a lot of different variables there that have come into play. So you've thought about the story, you've been paying attention to that jammer and how they've been doing against each of the different packs that you have. And they've been doing particularly well against the pack that is about to go out next. And so if you were to ice them in the box, your chances of controlling the game from that point on are maybe not as good as they should be if you just do the XY situation. So that's kind of like what I'm talking about with the story. It helped a lot to make me constantly adaptive and constantly reactive to events that were occurring. I'm not sure if any of you have been on the receiving end of a game against Texas, but they very cerebral team. They're very, very reactive. They, especially when the likes of Smarty, JD, and a lot of those other really intelligent players like Bloody and Hyper were playing for them. There's a lot of brain going on there, and you've got a lot of smarts to really work against. So you need to constantly be reactive and constantly be adaptive to what they're doing. You can't just follow a set formula, because it'll bite you in the ass very quickly. So it's, if you are to apply this kind of way of bench coaching, then it's something I would strongly recommend talking to your team about, because it can be hard for certain players to come to terms with this, to deviate from the plan. Like, some players need like, okay, this is what I'm going to do when this happens. This is what I'm going to do. Yeah, so um, it can be difficult for them to reconcile in their mind on the fly a change of plan, even though it might be the right change of plan. And because this is something that'll take trust from them, and it's going to take practice, including mistakes from yourself. So this is if you do decide to do this, I would recommend practicing it at training, like do it during scrimmage. If you can facilitate it, create stories to play out at practice. For example, segments of games, subsets of games, or even whole games, where you can um, try and set out a goal before the game, which might inform how you try and influence the story of the game. For example, you need to win by a certain margin in order to get the ratio you need to improve your game score or whatever it is. So those kind of things are very important, because when you do it at scrimmage, when you do it at practice, it really doesn't matter if you make the mistake as long as you learn the lesson from it. Making those mistakes at practice, learning from them, and then minimizing the chances of them happening when it really matters. So I'm just going to touch base with you all now in color. People have really chosen this one. All right, so I'll put it up here. So, oh, it has to be behind. I don't like that at all. All right, so I don't know if you can read that word, but it says track manager. And so the first role that I'm going to talk about is the track manager. And I'm pretty sure if anyone's bench coach, this is one of the things that you have definitely done. So this is referring to the activity that's happening on the track. So comms to players that are on the track about like on the fly adjustments that you want them to make. So this can be thanks guys. Cleaning my whiteboard. Wow. Yeah, so this refers to on the fly strategic adjustments that you want them to do. So playing offense. Oh my goodness, it's all gone. Okay, here we go. Track manager. Cool. Thanks, Rule 56. Okay, so track manager is the first one. So yeah, we're talking about comms to players on the track about on the fly adjustments. So defense, play more offense, those kind of things. Comms to play about players standing or being released from the box. Comms about pack speed adjustments. Comms about player function changes. And what I mean by player function changes is if you want a player to skip out and start playing a little bit more offense, or you want to switch from your 3D 1-0 situation back to a 4D situation. It's those kind of communications. Comms about opposing teams' impending strategies. This is something that anyone that's bench coach will delay. This is something I'm sure anyone who's bench coach will attest to. Like, you will see an opposing team about to execute a strategy on your team before your team knows it's going to happen. Like, that's part of being that 16th player, is like anticipating, seeing those things building up and trying to get that information to your team as quickly as possible. So track management comes to your jammer as well. Lead, whether they're lead or not lead, how much time there is on the clock, what jammer pass the opposing jammer is on, and obviously whether you want them to call it or not. So the track manager one feels like the really obvious bench coach role. You're literally standing on the bench communicating to the track. So yeah, so that's the track management role. The next thing, which is something that you probably should be doing, and that's strategic observing and adjusting. So let me see if I can get another one in here and try and. That is absolutely not lined up at all. It's going to be great. Adjustments. Woo! Yes, so strategic observations and adjustments. So this is when you start seeing trends, when you start seeing things happening whereby your team is actually benefiting or not benefiting. watching the actions of yours and the opposing team on the track. And yeah, like I said, spotting trends, whether or not your strategies are being successful or not, or what strategies your opposing team is using to give them success. For example, is their jam start offense favoring the in, the out, or the middle? Or is there a particular player that you're always sure is doing offense whenever they're on the track? Is one of their jammers favoring a specific approach path? You know, all of these things are like observations that you want to make. And this needs this kind of narrative of the game, the story of the game, to be stored in your mind. Otherwise, you are simply just living in the moment, and it's hard to collate like the trends that you're seeing. So it's very easy when you're bench coaching to just live in the moment, like just at the moment try and say, you know, like do this, do that, do that, be that track manager. But in order to be an effective bench coach, I feel like you really need to be aware of those trends that are happening continuously throughout the game. So once you have that information that you've observed, you can start to disseminate that to the team. And so this is where the adjustment side of that strategic observing and adjustments comes in. Sometimes it's great to leave the solution making to the players. In fact, that is essentially a big part of the way that I always like to build a team, is empowering the players to find the solutions themselves, so that I had to do less work, I guess. No, I'm kidding. So that I could focus on other things, essentially. So if I built a ethos in the team, if I build an ethos within the team whereby the onus is on the players to solve the problems that are being faced by the team, then on the fly, without any input from the bench, they can start to make those kind of adjustments. So sometimes you absolutely need to provide a solution. Sometimes the players don't have a solution, and understanding the mentality and the personality of your team and its players kind of can help you to understand whether or not it is time for you to intervene with a solution or not. But yeah, so providing a solution to them can be as simple as saying something like, if a jammer's favored path, let's say a jammer takes a favored path of approaching in lane 3.5, and then juking in, attacking the middle, like trying to make a big impact on the middle. That's their favored path. So make the path that they never take, the inside line, look really appealing. You know, like you don't necessarily have to tell them, you know, like how do we solve this problem? Just say, like, just make them go somewhere else. You know, see what they do. Let's see what they do this other area. Like, stack that metal so that they absolutely can't hit that metal. And just see where they go and see if they've got anything other than that in their bag of tricks. And so this information can be disseminated in like a number of different ways. Obviously, a timeout is a pretty obvious one. Oh no! Oh, sorry, Aaron. Is everyone else hearing okay? Okay. Okay, great. Good. Okay. Thanks for that. Disseminating that information can be done in a number of different ways. I prefer not to call timeouts unless absolutely necessary, because I'm big on clock management. And for me, if the information can be disseminated in other ways other than a timeout, I would much prefer to do that. So no timeouts unless absolutely necessary. Having said that, sometimes the information needs to go to the whole team at once. For example, if everyone's heads are down, they need like a bit of a motivation or a refocusing, then a timeout can be very useful. because you can remove everyone from the anxiety of the game, bring everyone into that internal huddle as a team and get everyone focused again. So timeouts do definitely have their function, but with strategic adjustments, oftentimes that the way that I would deliver that to the team would be given to a subset of the team. So for example, if if um, if a jammer is having a certain success, it may be that they're only having a certain success against one of the packs. Therefore, I'd only give that feedback to one of the packs. Or maybe they're having it success against both of the packs, but rather than calling a timeout, I would wait for one pack to come off the track, and I'd say, blah blah blah. You need to change. You need to stack the middle so that we'll see what the other jammer does. And then as soon as the next jam ends, I tell the other pack, I know this wasn't about your jam that just happened, but I have some feedback about this jammer, blah, blah, blah. And say that information over the course of a number of jams, appreciating that I don't desperately need to call that timeout. Okay, so, all right, so the next thing is, let's see, shading, monitoring. All right, so this is essentially looking at what the officials are doing and trying to understand the impact or the impact that they're having on the story, essentially, and how you can work with the officials, or not work with the officials is not the right word. Work with the behavior of the officials to try and get benefits for your team. So it's essentially another opponent to consider, the officiating, or at least that's the way I would look at it. Is I would try and spot trends in the way that they were officiating the game. If I notice like a specific penalty called a certain way, you might want to treat this like a specific adjustment. So if an opponent's driving your walls forward really easily, you might want to consider adjusting your bracing style on the fly. Likewise, if an official's burning your blockers for multiplayer blocks, you might want to do the same. Consider adjusting your bracing style on the fly if you have that in your toolbox. But yeah, so those kind of things would be what you'd think about. The way you communicate to the officials is also key. I have definitely been guilty of communicating way too much to the officials, and in times where my team has felt very comfortable, I've probably been guilty of communicating not enough. If you do chat with them, I would strongly recommend trying to build a rapport before the game. And it helps a lot if you learn about them as people. Changing the officiating game, but talking to the refs during the game. Yes, that's a really good question. I have on a number of occasions felt like I have. Sometimes it's worked in my favor, sometimes it hasn't. I feel like communicating to the officials by telling them what they're doing wrong is absolutely not constructive. It doesn't seem to get the results you're after, which is understandable. Sorry, River. I'll try and jump less, I guess. Yeah, so, but talking of, like, one of the ways in which I feel like I've had the most success is trying to refocus them. So if I'm concerned about them calling a specific penalty, I will almost exaggeratedly appreciate their different call that they make, and then talk about, and then bring to them between jams conversations about that different penalty, and that helps them. Well, it doesn't help them. It helps me to refocus them into a different area away from what I want them to be thinking about. So in that way, I feel like it has helped. The way it's manifested itself worse is that a referee just stops making calls completely, and that's worked for both teams. But I think if you are communicating with officials, think about whether your team's going to get burned by it just as much as the opposing team. So if you're concerned about the opposing team not getting a certain call, but your team is kind of doing the same thing as well, then you should probably let that go. That's a mistake that a lot of people make, is they complain about every single penalty and then get frustrated when all of those penalties get called on their own team. So yeah, so as I was going to say, if you build a rapport with the officials. They're humans, just like the rest of us, and they're trying to do the very best job that they can. There is a lot more scrutiny put under them when they make a mistake than there is under a player, and anyone who has played understands full well that every player makes dozens, if not hundreds, of mistakes a game. It's just the nature of it. If no one made mistakes, then no one would get anywhere. And so the officials are put under a lot of scrutiny. Appreciate that, understand that, and I feel like one of the things that actually really helped me was just grabbing a crew head referee at an after party and chatting with them for 15, 20 minutes. It just helps you get an understanding of where they're coming from and all that kind of stuff. And it really helps when you have to chat with them in the middle of a game. It helps you to understand what motivates them and how you can get the best out of them and the best for your team. And the last thing I would say is to know the verbiage of the rules is really important. I feel like there's not a lot that gets better results out of discussions with officials than using the language that they understand. It can make the difference between a successful and an unsuccessful official review, for sure. And once you really know the verbiage really well, you can start to kind of just use the language in different contexts, shall we say. So rephrasing sentences when you're trying to argue your point and you're not entirely certain that the rules support your argument. You can rephrase the way in which the rules are worded in order to try and get the result that you want. All right, cool. So that's officiating monitoring. Were there any other questions on that? Smash had a really good one. Rivers jumping around. Cool. All right, sweet. I'm going to try and do a Q&A at the end. So I'm happy for you guys to like jump in like that, as long as it doesn't like sidetrack me for too long. But I might try and like hit a Q&A at the end if you've got any burning questions. All right, so the next one is, where are these people located? I'm not sure what you mean. What do you? Which? Where do they sit? Are you referring to? I'm not sure what you're referring. Oh yes, sorry. Yeah, to clarify, these are all just like roles essentially. This is all the things that I would do when I was bench coaching. So, like I said, this is just kind of like tasks that I would try and employ simultaneously while bench coaching. And so I think now with four staff, you'd think about like how to differentiate it. Okay, so the next one is player utilization. This is absolutely one of my favorites, something that I really did a lot of in the last, well, I'd say last like 4 or so years. And because I feel like at the moment, a lot of teams still run their lines in kind of a rotational system. Like jam 1, pack 1 goes out, jam 2, pack 2 goes out, jam 3, pack 1 goes back out or whatever. And then jammers, if you've got 4 jammers, they just run on a 1 in 4 rotation. So player utilization is a big one, and essentially it's all about trying to put out the best player in that moment based on what's happened, based on the story of the game essentially up until this point. And it's not uncommon for teams to have a pack which has 5 blockers in it, and you might go even rotation based on the opponent you're playing, or you might try and put out the best players every jam. So Yeah, so there's a lot of things to consider with making sure that you're putting out the best players in that moment. Um, one of the obvious ones, which you see a lot of teams doing at the moment, is matching your jammers to their jammers. So when the opposing team puts out jammer X, you put out jammer Y. Um, or teams over the course of a game who are a little bit more savvy will start to work with their jammers to understand whether they're having more or less success against one of the two packs. This is a really good thing to work on with your jammers at training for them to be able to understand that, because oftentimes feeling of success can lead to actual success, and oftentimes a feeling of difficulty, regardless of whether they are struggling, can lead to difficulty for a jammer. If a jammer doesn't feel like they're having success against an opposing pack, but they actually are, you can either try and like motivate them and say, no, actually you're doing really well, and that may or may not work, or you can try and move them onto to another pack or against another pack to try and see, because sometimes if a jammer is convincing themselves that they're not having success against a certain pack, they will start to not have success against that pack. Um, matching matching your packs to their jammers, that's another one. So for example, if they put out a certain jammer who's big on pushing and you've got a bit more of a hench pack, you put that pack out against them. Yeah, and so the last one would be obviously matching your pack to your jammer. So if you have, I think a classic example would be if you have an offensive player in one of your packs that a specific jammer really likes, making sure that that jammer goes out with that pack can be quite useful. Um, yeah, so these can all be predetermined, but adjustable on the fly. So you start out by saying when they put out X jammer, we're going to put out Y. So, or it can be reactive on the fly based on the events of the story. And if you do this, if you be reactive with who you're putting out, it's much harder for the opposition to pick up on if you do it this way. A savvy opposing bench is probably going to start to cotton on to what's going on, but I found it very useful to not show my hand early on. Just kind of like go with the standard rotation. Like I don't really care who the opponent is. We're going to put out the rotation based on what we think their rotation will be, and then we'll see how we go from there and make our adjustments on the fly. Hopefully, we're not 30 points down within 4 jams. But yeah, that generally got really good results for us. Yeah, so this whole like player matching thing is why you're seeing a lot of like multi-pack starts, multi-jammers lining up on the jammer line, so the opposing teams can't at the last moment flick their packs to the right pack for the right jammer. But yeah, it's really important. So this can be a lot more complicated than just this player going out because at training they're our best player. And so this is the next point, which is, here we go. So player conditioning and performance monitoring. Yes, that'll do. Got it there. So yeah, player conditioning, oh no, it should just be condition. Damn it. So player condition and performance monitoring. So this is very much about really, really closely tying to player utilization. And if you want to be reactive, if you want to be on the fly with your player utilization, being observant of the player's condition and their performance is critical. So I used to use a internal mechanism to simplify it, because this is one of the things that I found hardest to do, because a lot of condition observing of players is tricky to spot. You can tell generally, excuse me, you can tell generally how a player is performing, whether they're maybe they're getting a lot of penalties, not so great. Maybe they're not blocking particularly well. Maybe they're banging up a lot of points. That's really simple to know. It can be really simple to know whether someone is performing well. It can be really difficult to know what someone's mental headspace is like. And so it was definitely one of those things that I found difficult to do. But being aware of this being one of the roles that can be very important to you, adjusting your lines is a good thing to do. So the system that I would use would be that either a player was hot, cold, or well, nothing, just not registering. So kind of playing their standard game. So if a player was hot, they're like playing really well, and I want to try and get them on track as much as possible. If players cold, I'm going to try and like rest them, maybe sit them. That depends on the situation. So this is really based on how they're performing. There can also be the consideration of their energy levels, what their stamina levels are like. Uh, can they skate more? Like a jammer might be hot, but if they're gassed at the end of 40 seconds of jamming, then maybe not. Do they need more of a rest maybe between jams? What's their physical state like injury wise? Is there a new or historic injury that might be affecting how they play? This is something that, like, as you get further into the story, that really start to manifest themselves in whether you utilize your players more or less, and what's their mental state like. Like I talked about that. Generally, if you spend enough time with your players, you can identify when they're in the zone or when they seem distracted by events that are out of their control. So yeah, it's a really good thing to think about those things. A lot of those things can only be uncovered with like short, sharp conversations post jam. So just checking in with players. If you notice something, like pulling the trigger on a conversation with them and just saying, hey, like how are you feeling about playing against this jammer, or how are you feeling that when? And just trying to get a beat on where their mental state's like. Because if you know them as people, then you can generally get an idea of where they're at and how to inform whether they fall into that hot or cold category. So those chats can be really revealing and may well inform your player utilization. Yeah, so I mean, a classic example would be one of your jammers is doing really hot. You've got a 1 in 4 jammer rotation. You really want to keep your jammers matching up with packs, but one of your jammers is really hot. They feel like they can do 1 in 2, and you've only got 7 minutes left of the game. Just do it. Just go for it. Pull the trigger on it and make it happen. Cool. So that is the performance monitoring. How are we doing on time? We are doing okay. Are we? Yes. Okay, cool. All right. So the next one, and one of my favorites is, and I'm running out of space to write stuff here, is clock management. All right, cool. So clock management, this is one of my favorite things. It's a really obvious one, but it has loads of nuances to it, and I could probably speak for an hour on clock management alone. So I'm just going to try and touch on a bunch of little things that can help make the clock work in your favor. And as you've all bench coached, I'm sure there's probably a couple of these things where you're going to, think that they're pretty obvious. For example, the first one, if you're calling a timeout, do it either straight after the jam if you need to conserve the clock, or right at the end of the 30 seconds between jams if you want to burn the period clock. So that is one of the tricks to use, or pretty much the trick to use, that helps you burn the clock using inactive game time. There are methods that I've used historically to force an official timeout, which I never felt, it always made me feel a little bit icky, but it's, if you got to stop the clock, you got to stop the clock. Yeah, I feel like the reason I decided I didn't feel icky about it is because good head referees would wait until the 30 seconds elapsed and then call the official timeout. Bad referees would call it right then and there. But yeah, so that calling the timeout at the right time helps you burn the clock using inactive game time. So game time where players aren't actually playing. So most of the others are for burning time when you're in control of lead jammer. Although there are some techniques that you can use to manipulate when you're not lead as well. When you're not lead and the other jammer is lead. So burning and conserving time in this instance can come in two forms: game time and penalty time. So burning or conserving penalty time as well as game time. And this is why it's really important to think about the story of the game up until the point where you are. If you get too caught up in the moment, you can often find yourself not sure what the right thing to do with regards to even calling a timeout. Like, you can be like 10 seconds into the time between jams and go, holy shit, I should stop the clock. Ah, damn, I was trying not to swear. Yeah, so you could have tried. You should really be thinking about like the story of the game up until that point, and then trying to make sure that you're factoring all that in, and not just tunnel visioned on the current moment. So understanding the story of the game up to this point is important, like weighing up which of conserving or burning game time or penalty time is more important to you right now. So calling off, having your jammer, for example, call it off as soon as they break the pack, or waiting until the opposing jammer hits the back of the pack. That's another straightforward one. Having your blockers speed up or slow down the pack. Generally, when the pack speed is either really fast or really slow, or even worse, going in the opposite direction, one of the teams is wrong. Now, it can be really complicated to work out which team is wrong because of the whole game time versus penalty time situation. And this is one of those things where it's important to maybe just sit down, talk to yourself about it, and say, okay, here's a scenario where it is a little bit more complicated, and build a story for yourself ahead of time, and maybe even like play that out at scrimmage, and say, okay, what would we do in this situation? Would I call it early, even though my players are in the box, because I need that game clock? Or would I call it later to get the players out of the box, but burn up a lot of the game time, which I really, really still need? So that's something to really think about, those really nuanced moments. And I strongly suggest practicing them either internally by yourself, just like hypothetically throwing situations at yourself and deciding what you might do. Or having your teammates or your assistant coach do that for you. Another thing that you can do to inform whether the jam is called early. Well, one thing that you can do when you're not lead is talk to your jammers about their lap speed. So obviously, when your jammer breaks the pack, you want them coming in the pack as fast as possible. Yeah, if you, as the bench coach, have identified a moment, like these moments actually happen a lot more than you would expect, where the opposing jammer's scoring, your jammer's still on their initial pass, they're both in the mix there. The opposing jammer's scored all the points. They perhaps don't even realize that they've scored all the points, and there's no real reason to it. Your jammer breaks the pack and they start skating around, but they're still fighting through. If you've got players in the box or whatever, and that jammer still thinks they're scoring points, if your jammer eases up on their lap speed, you're going to burn penalty time. And it actually happens more often than you would believe, that players don't realize they've scored the points or just don't hear the call from the bench or whatever. If you're like burning it into that pack, they're definitely going to call it as soon as they clock you. But if they don't see you in danger of scoring, then they might not call it so early. Okay, so one of the other things that I like to chat about is like the last 7 seconds of the jam. Now, this isn't necessarily, I guess it is clock management. So this is kind of something that I see a lot of teams do, is they've got an opposing jammer really locked down, like really locked down. They've killed them on their initial pass for 1 minute and 50 seconds. So there's 10 seconds left of the jam, and your jammer's in there scoring points, and they're kind of like struggling to score points, but they're not able to get those last few because they've been skating for almost 2 minutes. The last 7 seconds of the jam, there is no reason why you still need to be playing defense, but teams still do. And you may as well use those last 7 seconds of the jam. Now, using the full 2 minutes is a really easy example. But if you're thinking about your player's scoring potential, you might just be thinking, okay, let's just get this jam done. It's 1 minute and 30 in. Our jammer's really struggling. We're wasting a whole bunch of game clock. Let's get the offense in there. Let's let that jammer out. Let's get those points, and let's get this jam called so we can get fresh legs out there. So it's using that like last we called it the last 7 seconds, which is essentially the time we thought it would take a decent jammer to get from the front of the pack all the way around to scoring pass again. The other one that a lot of teams do these days is running long jams. Thanks, Billy. Sorry, I just saw your message. Running long jams. So this is where we talk about like points ratio potential versus time conservation. So how important is it that I conserve time versus what is the likelihood that I'm going to score a better points ratio than my opponent? For example, people often run long jams on the hope that rather than winning, sorry, it's more of a points differential, not points ratio potential, points differential potential. So rather than settling for a 4-0, they'll run it a bit longer and hopefully go for something like a 12-4, which gives you an 8-0 win essentially. So this is something that teams normally do versus pivots or weaker jammers. So clock management is big for that. So running long jams doesn't make sense for us to burn all of this time in order to potentially get more points than the opposing team. And the story of the game can play a huge part in forming your decisions on running long jams or not, because there's a lot of things that can factor in, especially towards the end of the game. I think like the rate at which your jammers, actually I'm going to talk about that next, so I'm going to skip that bit because that's going to be the next role. So yeah, the last thing I want to say on clock management is factor in the call it off delay. Just because you think that right now is the time to call it off does not mean that that's when the end of the 4 whistles is going to happen. There is always there's a delay from your voice to the lead jammer, for the lead jammer to actually hear it, for the lead jammer to start being in a position to be able to touch their hips, to actually touch their hips twice, for the jammer referee to actually be able to see it, the jammer referee to then put their whistle to their lips and then blow the whistle 4 times. So factor in the call it off delay. Know that you're going to want to call it off 5 seconds before you want them to call it off, and then ask them like 3 seconds before, because that delay is really annoying. If you get that wrong, it can cost you points and be really frustrating. So that's a little bit of a clock management thing there. I just wasn't sure where else to put that. All right, so the next thing is points management. So I think I kind of touched on this a little bit. So this is the rate of scoring. This is the way I think about it. And this is a huge part of understanding the story of a game. I wasn't really sure whether to bundle this with clock management or put it in its own points management thing, but this refers to the rate internally you feel like points can be scored in the current game, at the current moment. So the freshness of jammers, blocker penalties, solidity of defense, all of these things kind of play a role in how likely it is for you to score X number of points. Holy shit, I just noticed the time. I swore again. X number of points in Y number of minutes. So in a game where blockers are bleeding to the box, left, right, and the center, and jammers are really fresh and really fast, a 60-point lead might not be so insurmountable. But in a game where it's like taking over a minute to get lead and multiple scoring passes are really rare, a 30-point lead can feel really, really dominant. So that's why it's important to understand the story of the game. Just don't look at 30 points and go, well, I've seen people do that before. But yeah, so think about with your actions, increasing your future point scoring potential. So for example, your jammer out there may well have lead. They may well have already banked up 10 unanswered points. It's 1 minute 20 into the jam. Their jam is still in their initial pass, but your jam is now struggling getting past the remaining 2 opposing blockers on the track. So there's only 2 blockers left on the track. And you're just wow, they just look really gassed. Yeah, in 40 seconds, you'd expect that they'd be able to get those points. They maybe even could come around for another one, but they're looking really gassed. By the time they come around again, they might be facing more than 2 blockers. But their scoring rate has dropped for this jam, and it happens at the end of every jam for every jammer. Their scoring rate goes down in the jam. Perhaps it would be better to put out a fresh jammer. in a 4-2 start, who may be more likely to score more points and give you control of the next jam as well. So control the clock and increase your future point scoring potential. It might not even be that clear cut, but that's like a clear cut example. Your jammer might just be gassed, and you can't afford to spend 40 seconds trying to pick up 2 points. So it might be as complicated or as simple as that. So, holy cow! I have one 1 minute left for all your questions. Okay, so really quickly, does anyone have any question? Question mode has been enabled. Really sorry, I kind of like rushed that at the end there, but yeah, hopefully you guys got some good information out of it. It was really fun talking about it. I feel like because I've taken some steps back from high level bench coaching, I feel a lot more confident giving up all of the secrets that I kind of like picked up over the year. Does a bench have to have been a player? No, absolutely does not have to have been a player. I feel like it provides a level of empathy for it provides a level of empathy for the players that you're bench coaching, which I found particularly useful. Specifically, I'll get to your question in a second, Stacey. Does a bench have to be a player? Specifically when the defense changed to be a lot more difficult. Like when formation defense came in, I hadn't been playing, and it was only when I went back to playing I realized how difficult it was. So I believe it helps, but it is absolutely not necessary. Okay, how many people fill these roles for your team? Well, these are all things that I did by myself. So when I was doing it, it was the lineup manager and me. Since it's gone to 4 people, all I did was my missus asked me if I could help out on the bench for playoffs. So I just sat there and I did the strategic observations, player performance monitoring, and player utilization stuff. So yeah, so it was just kind of like those are all the things that I did with 4 people. I think you can really do that. Stat system. Yeah, so we would, when it was available, we would use Ringster as much as possible. Back when I was doing it, we definitely didn't really do a lot of stats tracking stuff, but there was definitely a lot more stats tracking happening at playoffs this year. For example, we had someone based in London who was doing like heat mapping, where jammers were getting out, where they were getting lead, all of that kind of stuff. Yeah, yeah, I miss Ringster too. So then next, does that answer? Hopefully that can answer. How do you work together as bench, lum, stats? I feel like me and Kev, who was the last assistant manager I had a really good vibe. Like we would go into a plan with like a rough idea of the order of jammers that we wanted and the pack rotation that we wanted. And I would throw stuff at him like, I want this change, I want that change, this is what I'm seeing, this is what I'm seeing. And so that would be essentially how we would work together. The system that London used this year was a lot more complicated. Kev was essentially just doing strict lineups, and I was still trying to like give him those kind of adjustments. We had a track manager who was just focused on the track, focused on the officiating. So there was someone who was very much focused that way. There was someone who was very much focused on the mental performance, physical performance of the players on the bench, and then I was the strategic person. It was a lot of like people talking around. Coaches do you use on your bench? I guess all of them are coaches, for lack of a better term, in different coach hats, essentially. They're the only session coaches that were there. There was only one session coach. Like the track manager coach was at training sessions regularly. I unfortunately was not able to go to any of the training sessions this year, or many. I was able to go to like 2 or 3. But one of the other guys there, the one that was the performance monitor and the physical mental monitor, he very much focused on yeah, leading sessions, etc. Cool. Any other how to deal with them? Yeah, okay. So, I mean, the first most obvious one would be, is there a trend in their penalties, or is it just like a mixed bag? If it's a trend, then it's a technical skill that needs to either be learned or unlearned or refined. If it is a mixed bag, this often lends itself to being a number of things, either a mental situation, or they are the kind of player that when they do an action, it has a major impact. And I feel like that was kind of a bit of an epiphany for me, was understanding that the reason why one of my best players was getting a lot of penalties is because whenever they hit someone, they stayed hit, and like, like four of our other players could have done the same hit and it wouldn't have had the same impact and therefore wouldn't have been a penalty. But because this person did the hit, it's a penalty. And so having them have to adjust their gameplay to try and be less of the aggressor, I would say. If they generally get a lot of penalties, they have a tendency to perhaps be, well, in this instance, this player was quite strong, and I suggested, like, rather than showing them how strong you are, ask them how strong they are. Let them see if they can outmuscle you. You know, don't necessarily show your force. Let them see. Have them try and show their force. Yeah. Okay. Would you utilize roster scales who are likely to be on a low or zero rotation? Sorry, I missed that one. Oh, here we are. Like to live on a low or zero rotation. Do any bench rolls? I would not. I feel like that is yeah, that's kind of telling them. I mean, as much as I would say you're going to be on a low rotation, I still consider them to be a player and have a role to play. I'd want to make sure that should we need, I mean, we have them on the bench as a player for a good reason, because they are good enough to play if they are, if it's necessary, like if there's injuries or anything like that. So I would say no, I would never have done that. But that's not to say that that's the right thing to do. That's just not something I would do. Okay. I don't know. We've gone quite a bit over, but I'm going to let Maha say whether we have to stop or not. So, do you communicate, give feedback to your blockers during the jam, or do you have a blocker bench and a jammer bench? I try to communicate also to the blockers with offense, defense, jammer standing. Do need to improve somehow? Okay, this is a lot of information. Thank you. Yes, I absolutely do. I don't have a blocker bench and a jammer bench, as much as they kind of like sit separately. Actually, the packs sit in their own. It's essentially pack one bench, pack two bench, and then jammer bench. I think a lot of teams do the same thing. Offense, defense, jammer, standing, do X, Y, but need to improve somehow. I would absolutely say develop a standardized language. Develop a standardized language and use that at training. As much as possible, be monosyllabic and have them have the words sound different enough that they can be differentiated in a loud environment. For example, try and avoid using the word wall when you want them to be defensive, because that sounds like call, and jammers have a tendency to call it off when you scream out wall. I can tell you from first-hand experience. So as a result of like the formation defense, we would yell out shape, which meant I was telling my team, you are not in a shape that I like right now. I need you to be in a shape because the jammer's incoming. Get into a shape, and it will remind people to get into their right positions. Cool. All right. Is that all of the questions we have? Cool. All right. Thank you very much, guys. It's been surreal speaking to a chat window. You guys have been great. Thanks for listening. It's been really fun. Really fun, like divulging all of this information after all these years. So I hope you enjoy the rest of Rule 56. If you want to get in touch with me, you just get me on Facebook. I'm more than happy to talk derby to people. So if you have any questions, go for it. All right. See you later, guys. Bye.